Okay. My name is Saji Prelis. I'm with Search for Common Ground. I have the privilege of supporting our children and youth programs here at Search. I want to give you a very warm welcome, but it's warm outside, but hopefully it's cool in here. And thank you all for coming to our Washington Network for Children Armed Conflicts meeting. It's a really exciting topic, and of course there's a lot of interest from looking around. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and new faces also. Let me take a couple of minutes to describe what the Washington Network is. It started, I think, back in 2004 in partnership with the USAID's Displaced Children Orphans Fund as a place where people like you and others can come together and explore topics that impact or affect young people in conflict-affected situations. We've had research presentations. We have had interactive workshop type sessions around different topics. So over the since 2004, on a regular basis, we've had many different events. So this is a continuation of that as a space to interact, share knowledge, and engage in understanding the issues of young people in conflict-affected environments. So I'm really delighted to welcome you again here. Also, in the last several months or so, we've also expanded this room to engage people who are not in Washington or not able to be here in person. So we will have folks coming online as well. So welcome to the folks who are joining online. I think last time we checked, there was about 26 or so people who said they will join online. And Jessica, my colleague back here, I'll ask her to quickly introduce herself and also tell us what's happening online.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Murray. I'm the Communications Manager here at Search for Common Ground. And so this is Google Hangouts on air. So people will be able to ask questions live, and we'll be able to see those questions and answer them when they come up. So please, if you're online, I know you can't see me right now. I'm off the screen, off the camera. Go ahead and write your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
And we are fixing the Wi-Fi code. Sorry about the mess up, but it will function soon. And for those who are looking for a restroom code, the restroom code is also available. It's outside on the right-hand side. So let's get started. I'd love to start it off, and let's see who is in the room. Say your name, agency, and I'll start in front of me and then go around the room. Then we'll go to the presentations after that.
Hi, Maureen Greenwood-Baskin. I'm new with Wealth Being Advisors in the International Child Rights Program.
Sorry, I forgot you, man.
Michael Gibbons at Wellspring and Children's Rights Program.
Melissa O'Cristo, OFDA, Rush Advisor.
Penelope Nelson, I'm with Department of Homeland Security's Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Unit.
Hi, I'm Molly French, and I work with Penelope. Jessica Boscovite with World Vision.
Christina Miller with World Vision.
Kirsten Harris with Eastern Congo Initiative.
Morning, I'm Martin Hayes with the USA DCOF.
Austin Peterson, Department of Labor's International Child Labor Office.
And I'll go back here and go around the back.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm with Search for Common Ground.
Viera with Search for Common Ground.
Christoph Kohlhagen, I'm with Search for Common Ground.
Kristen Moore, I'm with USA DCOF.
Anna Miller, I'm with Search for Common Ground.
Lee Hoffman, the UN Information Center.
Nadia Luga, the Enough Project. Melissa Cuddy, the Enough Project.
Chris Bonet, Search.
And Celia Ravon, Search for Common Ground.
And Corbett, Search for Common Ground.
Sarah Comstock Green, Search for Common
Martin Thanks, Search for Common Ground.
Andy Simonson, Search for Common Ground.
Jessica Lenz, Interaction.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introductions. There's a sign-up sheet going around. Please pass it around so we actually have your contact information. What will happen with that is we'll put that in our listserv so you'll hear more of the other events that the Washington Network organizes on a regular basis. Anyone who has not signed the sign-up sheet, we'll make sure you get it. And I'll take a minute to also introduce to you John Williamson from the Displaced Children Orphans Fund at USAID. John, it has been a pleasure working with you for many, many years now on these topics. So, and with the help of donor support and USAID's ongoing support in helping us make this Washington Network successful. So, John, thank you for your help and leadership and guidance on this. And over to you.
All right, thank you, Saji. It's great to be here, and just to underline, this is our 10th anniversary. So, happy birthday to us. We've got a very interesting program today. That's why there's a good number of people here in the room. In 2005, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1612, calling on Secretary General to report on grave violations against children in the context of armed conflict. And so, to do that, it's necessary to gather information and reports. And that's where things get difficult and interesting. So today, we're very fortunate to have two really outstanding presenters. Eva Smets, who is the Executive Director of the Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, is going to be presenting a resource pack that Watchlist has developed. It's a resource pack for non-governmental organizations on civil society engagement with the monitoring and reporting. So that deals with reporting on specific cases, specific violations, critically important in terms of documenting problems. Les is going to talk about, Les Roberts of the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, the program on forced migration health. He's going to be talking about a complementary approach to reporting, which is more survey-based. It's how to understand the actual prevalence of these grave violations. Because we know when we've been able to document a few cases, it describes the nature of what's happening, but it doesn't describe the actual magnitude. So these are two potentially very complementary approaches that can help draw attention of the world to these grave violations and hopefully address them in effective ways. So with that, I just want to turn things over to Eva and Les to present.
As they're preparing, we want to make sure this is a conversation too. So it's an interactive discussion. While as soon as the presentation is over, there'll be question and answers. We hope you will engage us all in a good discussion also.
Okay, then I'll start.
Just
It's interesting.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys.
Something funky happening on the screen.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. As said, my name is Eva Smets. I'm the director for Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict. We are based in New York, which is, far, far away from here. And we mostly engage with multilateral advocacy, which is an entirely different beast than the typical bilateral advocacy, of course, which happens with the US government based here in Washington. So a couple of things that I might be talking about, and especially some acronyms that I will be using, because that's a handicap that we all seem to cultivate, may not be so familiar to you. So the moment that I tend to do that too much, please sort of like raise your hand and say, what does UNSC stand for, or something to the likes of that. But still, it's really an honor for us to be here and to explain a little bit more about Watchlist, and also to explain a little bit more about this research spec that I'll talk a little bit about here today. As I'm just going to say a few words about Watchlist, I'm also going to hand these around, because this is the actual research spec, which you can all take home with you today. We have decided not to print it because we're very green, and also because it's actually targeting mostly people who are active in the field, and it's extremely cumbersome for them to be walking around with big manuals and binders like this, which no one does. They will just leave it in the office and they won't actually use it. Now, obviously, this is much easier to be carrying around. It's available in English and in French, and they're both on your drive here. So I'll just pass these around. There's another one here that can go that side, and please feel free to take as many as you want. So perhaps as a short introduction for those of you who do not know us very well, and I'll pass these around as well. Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict really is a network of NGOs. That's the best way to think about us. We're not an independent NGO, non-governmental organization, but an advocacy network of a range of human rights and humanitarian organizations that decided a while ago by now, in 2001, that the UN Security Council was starting to advance on this particular thematic protection agenda, that is the agenda of children in armed conflict. And there was a decision among civil society organizations that we needed to be there. We needed to be present in New York. We needed to have dedicated advocacy capacity in order to continuously pressure the UN to make sure that this agenda would be as progressive as possible within the context of the UN, would be the afterthought that I add to that. At this point in time, our membership consists of 9 organizations. You will be familiar with them. Some of them are here in the room. These are the large service providing or human rights organizations that are active on the topic of children in situations of conflict. Save the Children International, World Vision International, Human Rights Watch, Terre des Hommes International, and I lose my count every time again, Norwegian Refugee Council. They're going to be very upset with me. War Child International, thank you very much, Les. The Romeo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative, CSI, which is Child Soldiers International, or the former Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, and Geneva Call, which is an organization that is specialized in humanitarian dialogue with armed non-state actors. So that's just a snapshot of who we are, and anyone who's interested in learning more about us, please visit our website. You can put your name on our listserv, and I'm also happily available to discuss more with you. Now, let's jump into this tool that we're here to present today. And I'm especially grateful that I'm speaking today together with Les, because everything that Les is going to say about some of the problems with the monitoring reporting mechanism and whether it is able as a passive survey methodology to capture prevalence of grave violations is actually at the core of why we developed this research spec. So I think these presentations really work well together. So let's look into our first question. Why, first of all, would we need a resource spec for NGO engagement in a monitoring and reporting mechanism? Then you're going to learn a lot more about this when Les goes into a little bit more detail. But really the essence where we come from, we've been around for almost 14 years now, before Resolution 1612 in 2005, before the monitoring reporting mechanism was set up. As an advocacy lobby, we were very active in pushing the UN to have such a monitoring mechanism, but we're also been following the setup of the monitoring mechanism, the reports that they produce, so we're also quite familiar with the pluses and the challenges of this network. Now, one of the pluses from our perspective still is politically that it exists and that it can lead to the global community taking some action versus perpetrators. The minuses lie in its essence as a survey mechanism. As I said before, it's not an active survey mechanism like some of the methodologies that we briefly touched upon in Les's presentation, like a household survey that would go from door to door, knock on doors and collect proactive data. No, it's a passive methodology. That means in the countries that it is present, you will have a focal point who, and I'm characterizing a little bit obviously, but basically who sits in his or her UN office and it waits until the data approaches them and then needs to go out and verify this data. So needless to say that if this is a passive methodology survey, it works better if as many first-line monitor engage with it and provide it with first-hand data to work with. And of course, from where we sit, we represent civil society, NGOs, so hence the logic would be that the monitoring reporting mechanism would perform better if more NGOs are engaged with it and participate in it. But then comes the tricky part, of course, where the UN has a political mandate to implement this monitoring reporting mechanism. Once a party to conflict has been listed for grave violations, they have to implement this. The UN mission or the UN country team in a certain country or region has to deliver on this. But NGOs don't. They have a choice whether they wish to engage with this mechanism, yes or no. So they need to be encouraged. They need to be convinced, why is this important? And why is this important? Obviously, first and foremost, for the children themselves. Then a third part is, it's also to bear in mind, is that even when they participate, there's many various ways that they can participate, and we also have to incorporate that in our thinking of how can you support NGOs to participate, how can you help them to build the resources to build their capacity. So, there's different capacities that they may have, there's different objectives that they may have for engaging. For example, just in our own membership, a Human Rights Watch is going to participate in this agenda for many different reasons than a Save the Children, who is a human rights organization versus a service delivery agency. And then, of course, NGOs do also have constraints. And then first and foremost, we're usually talking about security. Security issues that can be physical security for staff programs, but also the type of repercussions that an NGO may experience when they engage with this mechanism. At the end of the day, this is a political mechanism. It's not a justice mechanism. We have to be very clear about this. It's a political mechanism with a direct link to the Council in New York, which is a political body. Now, of course, this may be very tricky for humanitarian organizations that deliver programs, life-saving programs on the ground to children and their families. Because if you're seen to engage with this mechanism, if you engage with this mechanism, what will that do to your capacity to be operational in the field? And then last but not least, another reason that we had to look into how can we develop a tool, a resource back for NGOs to help them make choices on whether to engage with the mechanism and how to engage with the mechanism, is that currently there are no tools for NGOs on this mechanism. And to put it bluntly, there's actually nothing publicly available about how this mechanism works in practice. There are UN tools and manuals available. I'm not saying that there's nothing, but these are not in the public domain. These are more internally developed for UN staff typically. So these were all some considerations that we had based on our experience over the years with engaging with this mechanism, with supporting local actors and national actors to engage with this mechanism, on why this would be a good idea to develop such a resource bank. So to capture that, what are our objectives with this resource bank? Why do we think it's useful to have, or why do we hope that you will also find that it's useful to have this? It's simple, it's straightforward. It offers civil society, specifically civil society, with a range of tools that helps them to engage in a monitoring reporting mechanism, but in a way that would strengthen both their own programs and the mechanism. Because any previous guidance that existed was usually drafted by UN staff mandated to implement the mechanism, whose objective, of course, is in the interest of the mechanism, not necessarily that of the first-line monitors that provide them with data and information. So we try to incorporate both concerns in the guidance that we offer. More specifically, what will you find in this resource spec? Tools that help you to conduct your internal reflection. Because typically what happens in the field before an NGO engages with this mechanism is a strategic reflection. Should we or should we not? And so there are some tools to help management, to help country staff, to help headquarters staff to navigate this decision making. There's also some tools that help you mainstreaming information about what is the monitoring reporting mechanism. Because in order to make these decisions and in order to allocate the right resources, you need to carefully understand what it really is. And we found that there's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of that not necessarily are correct, or expectations that not necessarily reflect what the MRM can truly deliver on. So making sure that everyone's well informed before they make the decision to engage and how to engage. And so lastly, of course, there's some tools that help you identify and address any technical capacity gaps that you may have, particularly on monitoring and reporting issues. So yeah, we go to the next one. For who is this tool? Mostly for the people who are here in the room, since we have quite a big NGO audience. It's primarily targeting NGOs, civil society, both international and national civil society. We really want to stress that part, who are active in conflict-affected areas and who either are currently engaging already with the MRM or who are planning to engage with the MRM. It can be both program staff, policy staff, management staff, both at field level and at headquarters level. But secondarily, and there is no UN staff here in the room, but there is? Oh, hi. But definitely we also feel it can be helpful for them, especially when they are tasked with implementing the MRM and with interacting with NGOs in the field, because we feel that they can learn a lot from the perspective of their interlocutors as well. How did we go about developing this tool? We spent about 3 months in very broad consultations with various NGOs, also with UN staff, mostly with what we call the tripartite, who is involved in leading the implementation of the CAC agenda, Children and Armed Conflicts, in the field, which is the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflicts, or the SRSG CAC. UNICEF and the Department for Peacekeeping Operations, just to make sure that whatever we were writing in the resource spec in terms of guidance on the MRM was also factually correct. Now, I do really want to nuance, because you might be asking, ooh, 3 months, that's incredibly fast to come up, with something so elaborate. Of course, it is based on years of experience in what we call our partnerships program. Our partnerships program is a program where we engage with national or local civil society actors, various countries around the world, and we've had several projects with them to reinforce their capacity on monitoring, reporting, and response on grave violations perpetrated against children's rights. So over a period of more than 7 years, we've had more than 26 partnerships. So obviously we've been culminating this experience and this insight in what is it like for NGO actors to engage with the UN on this mechanism. And this is sort of like the outcome of that experience, to make sure that we can share it on a broader base, that we can do further advocacy with that consolidated experience, and it doesn't stay within our office. Just a word on, what are some of the issues for NGOs? So, we've had this big program, so much engagement with NGOs. What are NGOs worried about when they engage with this mechanism, which may be interesting for you to also know? First and foremost, because usually when we engage with some of the UN agencies that are tasked to implement this mechanism, as I said before, there's sort of an assumption that everyone will want to do this, or NGOs obviously want to do this. Well, that's a very problematic assumption, because many NGOs have a lot of hesitations to engage with this mechanism. It's not about being hesitant to help advance child protection in the field, but it's the particular aspects of this mechanism and how it's set up and what its purposes are. I've already referred to the political nature of the mechanism. I've already referred to some of the security implications for NGOs. But also, and very, very importantly for NGOs or civil society, is this link between monitoring and response. This was something that came up and up again, because there is this feeling that we monitor at great personal risk sometimes. We send this information away, and what happens? It's very difficult to feel a tangible output of what happens with this monitoring data, because it goes into a very lengthy pipeline at the UN. And then finally, as I mentioned before, it also, putting a little bit, the hand on our own chest, it is also very important to manage expectations of NGOs when they decide, or if they decide, or in their process of deciding in engaging with this monitoring and reporting mechanism. The expectations are sometimes very high, and that leads to frustrations, withdrawal, and etc. If people are better informed of realistically what will happen when they engage, there is usually a lot less frustration and a better use of the information in various channels once it's being monitored. Because of course, once you do have that monitoring data, there's no need to only share that in the with the MRM. There's many different ways that you can. So very briefly, as I said before, we didn't make this up out of the blue. It is linked with existing MRM guidance, though most of this is not public, though UNICEF does assure us at some point it will become public, which they've said for a couple of years now. So these are just an overview of the different guidelines, manuals, toolkits, best practice studies, etc. that do exist. Where there were sections that were directly relevant to NGOs, we just refer the existing tools, such as what is the MRM, something sort of like factual. Like this, we don't reinvent the wheel, we stick to what is the general guidance. Where there are sections that are interesting, but specifically tailored to UN coordination staff, we've used that, but fleshed out issues that are more relevant to NGOs. And then, of course, there were issues that are relevant to NGOs, but simply weren't covered in the existing material, and that is really where we brought up new materials. So just to illustrate how it complements UN data. As I said before, you all have your sticks now, I hope. Please don't make me take any back to New York. Take some for your colleagues who are all fascinated in this matter.
You mean carrots, not sticks, right?
It is also available online on our website, and as I said, the current USB key holds both English and French. Interestingly, this might interest you because we're also always calling for more people to engage with us on this process. This is a starting point of a further longer process. It's not the end result. We are working currently with some funding received from the UK government on a one-year global dissemination project. So we're having 5 training missions in different conflict-affected countries. Mali, DRC, Myanmar, South Sudan, and Central African Republic, although we're probably going to change around the Central African Republic to Nigeria. And then the outcome of these training sessions with NGOs, any feedback that they give us on the resource pack itself will be incorporated in an updated version that we hope to finalize in the first quarter of 2015, which will also then be translated into Arabic and then of course be further disseminated. As well, if you don't happen to be a resident of any of these 5 countries, I'm doing these talks like I'm doing today. Last week I was in Brussels speaking to the EU. There is a feedback section within the toolkit itself. So as you open it, you will see that there's a page where we actively ask for people who use the resource pack to send us feedback as well, in the spirit that this really is a living document that we want to periodically update, and in this way really create a community of practice of civil society organizations that have an interest in this mechanism working as best as it possibly can for children on the ground. I will leave it at that a little bit. I can also give you a little demonstration, but basically I'll pass these around, which this gives you an overview of the table of content. Basically, what will you find, to be very brief, because I know that we need to give some time for Les as well, and we have time for questions. But basically, the resource pack itself is composed of 4 parts. It's very logical. It follows really a project implementation cycle. A part on understanding what is the resource pack, what is the MRM, how does it work, how do NGOs can engage. A part that is about planning. If you do want to engage in this, how should you define your strategy for engagement? And then once you have decided that yes, you want to strategically engage, how do you plan for operationally engaging with the MRM? A third part is really going through the practical steps. If you are engaging, what are some of the basic principles and ethical standards? How do you go about monitoring grave violations? Sections on information management and security management. Sections on how do you report grave violations. And then, as I said before, very, very important for an NGO audience, what are ways to better link monitoring, prevention, and response? And then last but not least, learn from your experience. Which is of course all about monitoring and evaluating your own engagement, what went well, what didn't go well, and how you can work better with. So usually I now make a flashy demonstration of the different tools, but I'm conscious also that Les has infinite wisdom to share with you here today, also about the MRM as a survey methodology. But I really do encourage each of you to, at least, you might not want to read all of the tools, but at least flip through it a little bit. You'll see how it's been devised. It's not one very long book or manual that has 200 pages of a narrative. It's a table of content of different tools. You get a table of content, you can click on each tool, the specific one that is relevant to you, which are all 1, maximum 2 pages. The essential information that is important for you to have when you're strapped for time, which we all are. But you do need to do the basics, and you want to make sure that you get the basics right. Every tool itself then refers to other tools that are related to the topic that you're at in a moment, so it helps you find the way to your next question, and it also allows you to immediately flip back to the table of contents. So that's how it's set up. And that's it. Thank you very much. For anyone who's interested in engaging further or asking for further training, perhaps for your organization about this, here's the contact details of our amazing partnerships officer, who is overseeing both our direct projects with partners, but also our component on institutional learning and advocacy that this resource pack is a part of. So thank you very much. And after this practical guidance, Les is going to tell you more about the violations.
So do we want to go right into this?
Yeah, well, go ahead.
So this might seem by subject like a non sequitur, but actually these two things meld very, very well. Eva started out saying Watchlist was formed to essentially keep the momentum going because the issue of protecting children in times of conflict was too important to not have a little energy out there. She very, very, very diplomatically didn't say energy out there pushing the UN. But that's what I'm about to get to. And in my talk, I'm going to skip over all the sampling and statistics and science. I'm here really just to talk about policy. But I'd like to talk about policy from the perspective of a couple of surveys we've done. The first one on behalf of UNICEF. Oh, right click.
That's here, I'll use this.
Thanks. And just for those of you who are going to go to sleep, I'll tell you I have 3 thoughts. The first thought is that UN Resolution 1612 is really unique. It either is framed to fail or it is framed to save the United Nations. And I prefer the second option. The second notion is, in at least those 5 places we've worked, the MRM have nothing to do with our survey results. They're not the same thing in any way. And finally, and most importantly, I think there's an enormous tension between the public health approach and the legal approach to analyzing problems. And until we sort of grapple with that and can be honest with that, I'm not sure we're going to move a long way ahead. So as already said, the UN Resolution 1612 was passed. And the reason I got really excited about it is because it had unique binding language in it that said the Secretary General would report timely, objective, accurate, and reliable information on the recruitment of use of child soldiers in violation of applicable international law and other violations and abuses committed against children affected by armed conflict. And it said that it would report trends. And from my perspective, this was just stunning in a UN resolution because it essentially is binding. It is saying, I'm going to be able to say that Sudan is worse than CAR. And suddenly, in this agency, in this entity that has largely worked very, very hard to keep all decisions in a political realm, there would be this external reality by which suddenly they'd have to say, why am I spending more money in Syria on this than I am in the Central African Republic? And the answer would likely be because there are more children being abducted or whatever it might be. And the UN has been reluctant to have these external controls in the past. And so this was quite unique. And then in the year after the resolution was passed, a working group was formed, and they decided that there were actually 6 grave violations: killing and maiming, abducting, recruiting, raping, sexual abuse, interfering with schooling, interfering with humanitarian aid. And those aren't in the resolution. Those came from the working group afterwards. But those 6 things make this really unique as well because they're not at all the same kind of things. It's sort of like combining avocados and herrings, putting in a bowl and thinking, oh, we're going to make a meal out of this. It might not be innately a natural combination. And I say that for a couple of things. My wife has 7 sisters, Irish Catholics. It's one of those things. And I have 3 siblings, and there's a few of them out there married. So we're this cohort of 15 that call ourselves brothers and sisters. And I know of 3 instances that would be classified as rape or sexual abuse that happened to those people before they were 16 years of age. And in 2 of the 3 cases, most of their siblings don't know it happened. This rape, sexual abuse, is really, really hard. It is really different in terms of other social problems in how little information moves away from the victim. There was a gal out in San Francisco. Her name was Deborah Russell, and she did an assessment of women to figure out if in the last year someone had stuck a penis in their vagina against their will. So very narrow definition of rape. And you'll see on the right the national crime, you'll see in the middle the FBI statistics both for San Francisco and nationally. By chance, a couple of years earlier, the CDC had done a national crime survey. And Deborah Russell, by having women sit in the kitchens of other women, female graduate students, without a clipboard, without a questionnaire, just sitting, drinking tea, chatting openly, could come up with an incidence rate 7 times higher than the best CDC telephone survey. So on the issue of rape, wow, there may be no health problem where the human quality of interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee is so determinant in whether or not you can detect whether or not an incident event happened. I contrast that with attacks on education. I had a graduate student in 2010, went to the capital of South Kivu, Bukavu, spoke with these 26 people who were the most senior education officials, mostly in the government, but in the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And they came up with a list of 167 attacks on schools. That's sort of the middle row there, that those educational actors knew about in the last 6 months. It turned out most of them actually happened in the year before. Not most. About 40% of them actually happened in the year before. Most of them really happened, but they might not have happened in the last 6 months, as was reported. But more than half of them did happen in the last 6 months. And in that window of time, the MRM detected one attack on education. So here is something where 85 times more information was available in Bukavu among authorities than had been captured in the MRM. This is something that's really easy to find out about. It's quite the opposite of rape, and thus lumping rape together with attacks on schools from an epidemiological and a measurement perspective makes no sense at all. Those are completely different kinds of things, and I would ideally and optimally find out about them by different approaches. Well, this resolution was passed. It took them about a year for the working group to figure out what their objectives were, and then eventually UNICEF decided, we don't know how to measure all this stuff, so they called in the CDC, and they called in us, the Department of Forced Migration at Columbia, because we were just a cheap subway right away. They called in CDC because they're good. They called in us because we're a subway right away. And we created this little working group trying to come up with methods for measuring these things. And on 3 occasions, UNICEF sent us, Columbia, somewhere to measure those 4 grave violations that happened to individuals. And the CDC did assessments in Sri Lanka and Nepal as well. So 5 assessments were done by this working group. And one of them was in DRC. And this was at UNICEF's request. So our goal was to figure out how many violations are occurring in South Kivu, what fraction of them were captured by the MRM, and to understand if there might be other systems operating that might be more helpful, and how well key informants knew about things. And I'm not going to get into the gory details, as I said, but this was just a classic survey, like we would do for measuring malnutrition or immunization coverage. We got population data from the Ministry of Health. We picked 40 villages. The phrase is proportional to population size, so if one village is 4 times bigger than another village, it was 4 times more likely we would show up there. We interviewed 20 houses in each village and 3 key informants, the chief, the head of the school, and the head of the women's committee. And in every village we went to, we would count the houses, and then if we wanted to go to 20, we'd figure out, well, every what house should I go to if I want to systematically pass through this village and end up with 20? So if there were 100 houses, you'd say, I want to go to every 5th house. And pick a random start, in this case 2, then we count up 5 houses, interview them, count up 5 houses, interview them, until we were through the end of the village. In 2013, we worked with the same partner. We did everything the same. We tried to go to the exact same villages. We hadn't recorded what houses we went to, so we didn't go to the same houses. But we went to the same villages that we had gone through to in 2010, used the same questionnaire. As much as we could, everything was the same. And here are the sort of numbers of people and recall period in the 2010 survey and in the 2013 survey. So characteristics are pretty similar. There was one of the clusters we couldn't get to. And here are, I'm sorry, the order is now reversed, I apologize for that. The results in terms of violations, both to children and adults, in the 2013 survey, and then on the right in the 2010 survey. In general, if we forget the MRM, if we just think about violence and abductions, the rate of violations had gone way down. maybe by 6-fold or something like that. If we limit ourselves to those events where it was done by a uniformed or armed combatant, and it happened to a child, in this case, child is defined as under 18, there was 1/7 as many events in 2013 as there had been in 2010. And what's stunning about this, well, stop. And one really interesting difference is that in the first round, about 2/3 of all violations were caused by government troops. In round 2, it was only about 40%. In that 2010 survey, most violations in the MRM had not been caused by government troops. So there seemed to have been in 2010 a self-selection bias of the information coming in that somehow looked disproportionately at the non-governmental military actors. We don't have the official MRM data from this second round. We have the Secretary General's report from 2013, and we can say for absolute certain there are twice as many in 2012 as there have been in 2010. Probably there have been 4 times as many. All reports from members of the protection cluster say in 2013 there were way more events recorded than there had been in 2010. So here you have the MRM with a trend saying from 2010 on, things got a lot worse. We do a population-wide survey, and they haven't gotten a little better, they've gotten a lot better, like a 7-fold reduction. And I think this is completely logical from the perspective as an epidemiologist. This is a graphic made by Patrick Ball. And he did it while he was at the National Academy for the Advancement of Science. And this graphic is showing 2 things. It is showing the number of killings that happened in Guatemala from 1960 to 1995. And in the dotted line is the percentage of those killings that appeared in the Guatemalan press. And you'll notice that when things aren't violent in the countryside, almost all the events are captured in the press. But when things got really violent and the press didn't go out in the countryside, the reporting went way down as a fraction. In 2010, 1/3 of South Kivu was a zone rouge, and the UN essentially couldn't travel there. By 2013, that was a tiny fraction where you couldn't travel, and it changed from month to month. Thus, so could this be true? I think the answer is yeah, a lot of things have changed. A lot of things have changed. Soldiers were being paid regularly by 2013, and when we asked people, why do you think this is, that was the #1 thing they said. There had been over 200 soldiers in that window of time charged with rape, and a couple dozen convictions. There had been a UN action plan signed between Kabila and the UN that said soldiers will not, and it was a very 1612-oriented action plan. That may be contributing. There had, not in Congo, but in the region, been a couple of officers convicted for their underlings committing rights abuses, and so maybe this changed the culture among commanders. Very hard to say. Realize there could be other explanations. It could be in 2013 people were just much more willing or much less willing to talk than they had been in 2010. That's possible. These events aren't verified. We talk to a family. If they say it happened, we just take them on face value. The UN can't do that in terms of their need for verified data, so they might not see this data as very meaningful. Note that there are other violations, particularly looting of crops, that probably are far more important to these people than these 1612 things we were asking about. And it's just not possible to attribute causation, even though we're quite sure there was, fairly confident there was a dramatic reduction in the occurrence. And when we did that 2010 survey, only 1 in 500 violations was being captured by the MRM. When we did the survey for UNICEF the year before, only 1 in 100 violations was being captured by the MRM. These are very, very insensitive systems. Very insensitive. And that's not so surprising. What fraction of rapes in this country result in a conviction? That's sort of like society's ultimate confirmation, yes, it did happen. It's probably not 1% in this country. So that shouldn't shock us so much. Interestingly, violations that involved UN actors seem to systematically get missed, depending on how you define those things. If you are willing to include girls under 16 having sex with UN soldiers or UN officials, officers for money, then I've stumbled across 6 violations as we did these in South Kivu. If you just involve killing, I've stumbled across 3. And none of those appeared in the MRM, and some of those, 3 of them, were reported by multiple agencies to the UN, and they didn't appear in the MRM database. Wow, does that piss people off? I think it pisses them off a little bit irrationally. This year, a couple of NGOs were doing something else regarding education right now. When I was there, whatever, last week or the week before, a couple of NGOs said these things like, well, you know, the UN is the main perpetrator of these violations. And I don't believe that for a second. I think that's just complete garbage. But I think when it happens that people know about in North Kivu, some child, a boy, reports a rape, the UN comes and confirms it, the soldiers come later on and kill the boy, and it only gets recorded as a rape and not a killing in the MRM. Like, that just spreads like wildfire around, and everyone hears about it. And thus, I think the few exceptions, the few cases where people have legitimate grievances, have this psychological magnification effect out there in the field that is really undermining the MRM in Eastern Congo. And as Eva said, these folks never get any feedback. They give in report after report after report, and they never hear anything back. And they find that quite disrespectful, and it is not encouraging. It doesn't create community. It doesn't create commonality of purpose. So in terms of, if you accept my notion that this system is extremely incomplete and has at least the potential for biases built into it, I think that we need to, if we're going to move forward, acknowledge that there is a tension between this legal approach. And Eva rightly said that this is about naming and shaming. This is about a political purpose. But it is a political purpose that works in a legal mindset. The SRSG's office is mostly made up of people with legal backgrounds. It's a legal mindset. And my approach, the public health approach, and the approach most programmatic operators would use, is much more interested in knowing what's going on out there, and it is fundamentally different. I want to know what the truth is in a way that represents the universe of events. I'm so eager to get that. I will promise people anonymity. I'll say I'll never write down your name. I'll never tell anyone I talk to you. I won't ever be able to find you again if you just please tell me the truth. From the legal approach, that is the opposite of what you want. The last thing you want to do is name and shame some agency and say, this soldier raped this girl on this day, and then later have the girl say, no, that didn't happen, that's not true. That's just a political disaster. We're in a courtroom or in the Security Council. That's just the worst thing. So a lawyer is willing to give up 99% of cases if he can be absolutely sure that one case he's going to bring forward and use is darn certain. We did a survey for IRC a few years ago about rape and sexual abuse. Let's just stick, And we did it in an urban and a rural county. So here's one county in Liberia. And we've done this in a lot of places, and the pattern is almost always the same. Even in times of war, the lion's share of raping happens from people that women know. raping of women, I should say. The survey just asked about women. So you'll notice that strangers are only a tiny part of the perpetrators in this province of Liberia County. On the left-hand side is who the perpetrator was. And across the top is who the victim told that this rape had occurred. And you'll notice that if someone is raped by a husband or boyfriend, they'll virtually never go to the police. If they're raped by a stranger or someone else in the community or a truck driver who passes through on a regular basis, most of the time they will go to the police. So in terms of that legal versus public health mindset, we've got this double whammy operating here, where certain kinds of events, rapes by strangers, dramatic things, are far more likely to come forward and be known. The victims are more likely to say it happened in public, and thus the legal process is magnifying those and creating the impression that rape by strangers, rape by soldiers is a dominant problem in Eastern Congo, when in fact rape by other people in the community is certainly causing a lot more morbidity and suffering. I think we need to acknowledge up front that if we can't measure trends or rates, we can't learn what's working and what's not working. Something really good happened, I think, in South Kivu between 2010 and 2013. How can we learn that if the MRM, of which we spend millions of dollars on in Eastern Congo each year, if it isn't giving us the ability to say, oh, things got better? There's an opportunity lost there from both the perspective of science and the perspective of all those people who are doing great things in the field that need positive feedback, and to be able to be told, oh, what you did these last couple of years, that's really working. I was really impressed to see a CDC, they call it VAX survey, Violence Against Children survey from Haiti. It isn't yet published, but I saw it presented a couple weeks ago. And this graphic was part of that presentation, and it's showing in Haiti, in that couple years after the earthquake, the vast majority of rapes are happening in the daylight hours. The vast majority. If you look at programmatic activity, the most rape-motivated spending has been on putting lights in camps. And so without some sort of reality data, how can we say, oh, the lights in those camps were a good idea or not a good idea? We need some population-based reality check, not just for setting trends, but for having a pulse as to what's the big problem and what's going on and are we doing the right thing. And finally, if the NRM is about naming and shaming, then we should expect of the UN the same transparency and accountability that we would expect if we participated in some enforcement mechanism with our own government. And lots of NGOs. I worked for IRC for years. IRC does lots of things in complement to and in complement to the legal mechanisms of the US government. And they're at peace with that. They think that reporting when children are battered by their refugee parents is a good thing. So they buy into that law and they report just like a school teacher would or anyone else. But they expect certain predictability and accountability things from the US government in exchange. And in those countries where IRC didn't trust the government, it wouldn't participate in the government's legal enforcement activities. We should be expecting the same thing of the UN if we are to be their partners in this. And if it's about naming and shaming, as Eva said, we should be thinking, well, what's our role? Is that in keeping with our goals? If it's not, if it's ultimately about reducing the incidence over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of these bad things happening to children, then maybe we need some sort of middle ground. It's not this UN-verified, less than 1% complete process, but maybe it's not this, oh, I promise you anonymity, I won't ever tell you anything, I won't ever tell anyone I talk to you, airy-fairy stuff that we epidemiologists do. maybe there's some turf in the middle. And I'd like to take the example, I'm sorry for the bad graphic here. I couldn't make it work late last night. I'd like to take the example of unemployment in the United States. The US government measures unemployment by two means. They call tens of thousands of households every month and ask if anyone is unemployed in that individual that they're speaking to. So they have a random phone survey, and here's data from 2000 to 2010. And they ask the, I think it's 20,000 largest employers what their payroll is, and they keep track of that. And this varies, you can't tell, but it's from 120,000 to about 132,000 from the exact same window of time, 2000 to 2010. So they've got these two systems, and they tell really different stories. It makes sense that when unemployment is going down, the numbers are going up. So these should be the opposite, but they're not exactly the opposite. And they've got these models that adjust for seasonality and adjust for other things. And so normally they can predict the unemployment rate just from this and predict the unemployment rate just for this. There was a window in 2009 where these two models differed by 50% in what the unemployment rate was. But the US government just kept reporting up. The unemployment rate is 8.4% or whatever it was. And we're at peace with that. We live with that ambiguity in this country, even though we think unemployment is really important. But realize when they say over the last 3 months, the unemployment rate has gone down 0.2%, the chances they're wrong is very, very, very low. They don't know what the unemployment rate is. The unemployment rate is very much affected by how they define unemployment and whether you need to have been applying for jobs and all that other stuff they use. So it's a soft number, but we've got a system that gives us trends. We've got a system from which we can learn what's working and what's not working. And that seems to me a logical place for Eva's packet to get those people who are really the eyes and ears of the MRM process to usher the UN to a spot somewhere between where they are and sort of unverifiable surveys. And on that note, I'll stop and the better part of the day will begin.
Thank you so very much for a very interesting presentation. So we just want to open it up to your questions, your comments, and if you have a discussion, we will go until around 10 and 12. At that point, we'll kind of open things up to any kind of information exchange, not focus exclusively on the presentation. But here's your chance. Some interesting presentations, and so questions? It's done in silence, yes.
So what does that middle ground look like? I mean, the moment you take away even one little thing like anonymity, I'm sure reporting plummets. I mean, can you really find a middle ground between the two?
Yes. And I think the way that would probably work is where I think UNICEF wants to go, but the SRSG wouldn't let them go with the MRM, which is to have NGOs reporting in unverified things that they have been hearing about and know about. I also think that there are some really simple ways to assess a monitoring system. And the most simple way is if my community of NGOs has gotten really aggressive about reporting attacks on schools, that's one of the ones that's most transparent, or killings, I can go out into the community, independent of my monitoring group, and get 10 attacks on schools that I hear about. And I'll go and I'll visit this school and make sure it really happened, or 10 killings that I hear about, and see what fraction of those are in my NGO's reporting mechanism. That is a way to, with very little work, have a pulse and say, you know, I think we're only capturing about 2/3 of events, or whatever the case may be. So as long as that second grab is independent, it can be a way to live with imprecision. And UN AIDS did something like that for a lot of years for estimating AIDS in Africa. And there are lots of other things we do out there where we We grab a big sample and we verify a tiny sample. And we say, even though I didn't verify those 17,000 episodes of rape I heard about, I did go out and chase down 30 of them, and 25 out of 30 times it was true. Therefore, I'm pretty sure it's up there in the 15,000 range at least. I think that is a profoundly powerful argument, and it is likely to give you at least that crude ballpark figure to be able to say, wow, now that this has happened, it seems that rape by soldiers has reduced.
And apart from understanding the trends, so hoping that it can get to what you've just described, making it timely information so it can be acted upon.
Yeah, and not just acted upon, but if you tell 2 years afterwards, oh, by the way, we confirmed that case you told us about, there's sort of no community or ownership in it. Yeah, do you have thoughts about timeliness?
Yes, I have thoughts about timeliness. I think the major problem with timeliness, and forgive me if I'm getting a little technical now on the sort of like the rest of the system, but I think and I think this helps a lot in terms of understanding what happens with the data going into the system. If I may call the children in our conflict agenda as now, of course. What happens when the data comes out of it, right? Because that's why we're doing all of this effort. What's that, the output side, which typically is, the office of the SRSG will write all this up in a country-specific report that is published. It's publicly available. It's called the SG Report on Children in Armed Conflict in Country X or countrywide. This is presented by the SRSG to the working group, which is composed of 15 council members, who then, based on this report, will start negotiations, political negotiations, about an outcome document. This outcome document ultimately is called the conclusions of the working group on children in armed conflict in country X or Y. These conclusions, like a Security Council resolution, are supposed to be binding. They're supposed to be a range of very practical actions that, of course, are for the UN country team or the UN mission, because the Security Council cannot tell government Y or armed actor X to do. They can, plea with them, they can recommend with them, but they don't control them. But they do control the UN actors that are present in that country. So that's sort of like how the system is set up, and it should contain a number of steps that are based on the information of the report that theoretically should contribute to this situation improving, which is where the first problem comes if your information in the report doesn't really tell you what is really happening in terms of it's getting better or it's getting worse, but just gives you a number of verified incidents. So you do know something is happening, but you don't quite know what your programmatic response should be towards it. Now, in terms of timing, what is the real problem that we as Watchlist are very concerned about is that this is going incredibly slow. For those of you who are interested in understanding a little bit more about this, on an annual basis we evaluate the working methods of the working group, which is a briefing note that's also available on our website. We've just published the one with the findings and the updated details for 2013. So basically we have an overview of what the working group has been doing between its existence in 2006 and 2013. The problem is, even though the system is set up to produce one of these reports per country that the MRM is presented in a yearly basis, and thus on a yearly basis you should have decision making in terms of what the UN is supposed to do in this country about this, is that first, reports lately have been published with an interval of 3 to 4 years. So for example, now we're expecting a new report on DRC to be published. The last one, if my memory is not escaping me, but 2010, perhaps 2009 even. For Myanmar, there was an interval of 4 years between the reports that were published. Then you have a report, But then it doesn't immediately mean that the Security Council will be able to address it, depending on how many reports are in the pipeline. And then it's not like negotiations end in a week and you have an outcome document. The average negotiation time last year was 12.9 months. The average in 2012, the average negotiation time in 2013 has improved. It's only 6.6 months. But so, if I go from individual child being raped in Eastern DRC by an armed actor in 2009, let's say we have a report by 2013, let's say we have it discussed in 2014, and perhaps we have an outcome document in 2014 or early 2015. So you can imagine, you know, the sort of, this is where our great concern lies with, you know, what is the timing of this system? And of course, this builds back into the frustrations of all of those excellent first-line people, first-line responders, first-line monitors that, you know, are involved with this individual child who has a need then and there, not 6 years later. And then, you know, that's when the outcome document comes out. Then no one really has even tracked what really happens, you know, between these are the, let's say, 10 recommendations that are in the conclusion versus these are the actions that were taken, and this is the outcome of the action.
So Eva's,
I don't want to be too...
thinking about the UN and using the UN system, I didn't even think of it that way. I think that if we look at examples where groups have come up with monitoring schemes, the UN chases to catch up. And thus, I think the community getting a system that works, having information that's widely accepted out there, will create energy, and over time they'll need to keep the MRM and the verification process, but they'll have other ways that they can use information in-house and make decisions. You know, here you have the amazing contrast that WHO will go look at 1/10 of 1% of all children in Nigeria and say what the malnutrition rate is, quite exactly. They might have only looked at 40 malnourished children, but they'll say, we think there are 40,000 extremely malnourished children, therefore we need food. Like, they're completely at peace with that, with the sampling only seeing the tip of the iceberg approach with malnutrition. And when you look at the landmine surveillance process, when you look at nutritional anthropometry developed by the Quakers in Philadelphia, when a good system comes out there, the UN chases behind and embraces it, uses it very quickly. And we just need to lead, not expect UNICEF to lead. UNICEF is very, very constrained by the places they are.
There are two questions coming from online. The first one is below. One is, should the child rights different from human rights? Which one comes first and why? And the second question is, how strong is the argument that exposure to violence and rape over time has created an imbalance or a default that allows rape and violence to continue and to be normalized in the culture?
I can answer that second question. The second question is, there is incredibly little evidence. There actually is evidence that HIV goes down in times of conflict. And thus, and in the CDC's work and in most every publication you will find looking at rape in times of war, soldiers are only doing a tiny, tiny fraction of all the raping. So the notion that it becomes normalized, if that's happening, my guess is it's got more to do with television, social media than it does with FDRC soldiers in Eastern Congo. FDLR, sorry.
In terms of the question versus child rights versus human rights, and here I also obviously invite experts from the audience to chip in, but from our perspective there is no difference. Children are humans, and child rights are human rights. None comes first, all come equal.
Anyone want to comment or add questions?
Could you talk a little bit about what the slowdown is at the UN, about why it's taking 6 years to get reports done?
How much time do you have?
Now's your time to boot it for a UN representative.
There's various reasons, and for various parts of the process. I think there's a difference between the hold-up in the report writing, which is due to the nature of the data collection, which is very elaborate and time-consuming, especially the UN verification. It's usually due to lack of staffing, staff turnover, and so on. A lack of, it may not always be prioritized by the UN country team to get this particular report out versus other reporting requirements that exist. The report or the data or some level of data may be ready, but the quality is very poor. And the estimation from the receiving end at headquarters is that this is not ready for publication and this needs to be reworked, and so on and so forth. So the reasons can truly vary from country situation to particular missions to even particular staff within missions. In terms of the negotiation time, or the adoption time, as we call it. For this, I would refer you to our briefing note. Again, there are both political reasons, structural reasons. The structural reasons are, the 15 members of the working group doing this job on children in armed conflict is not their only job. So peak periods where, for example, they need to participate in a third committee, the group might not meet for 2 months. In August, typically diplomats don't work. So, summer is a particularly challenging period to move that forward. There may be thematic discussions or resolutions that need to be negotiated. They will get priority over country-specific issues, and so on and so forth. So part of it is, structural. How many people do you have to, push forward a number of parallel items and negotiations? Part of it is political, unfortunately. At the start of the CACOGEN now, there was this energy that Les talked about earlier, this sort of feeling, because we're talking about children, we can overcome some of the geopolitical interests. And this was actually quite true in the early days of the agenda. However, this is no longer true. So, for example, predictably, negotiations over Afghanistan typically took 1.5 years because 2 member states, permanent member states, disagreed on which violations should be reported on. Is it attacks on schools, or is it killing and maiming by NATO troops? I'm not going to name names, but I think you can associate which one was, supporting which reporting style. Similarly, Syria is currently being discussed. It's very difficult to find political agreement, even when we're talking about violations perpetrated against children in a context like Syria. So, there are political factors that come into play. Then there are logistical factors that come into play because, it's very difficult to book a room with adequate translation. And some member states require to have translation ready, otherwise they won't meet to negotiate, and so on and so forth. So these are, just some illustrations in parts of the process of why it gets stuck. Where can there be no solutions found for this? Of course they can. But these are things that need to be worked on carefully, consistently, brought up again and again.
Maybe I can. This is Michael. I can raise the question about the third party in the room we're not talking about yet, which is the government, with jurisdiction over the setting where the violations occur. And in some cases, we're talking about failed states or parts of states in Central Africa where governance doesn't apply in real sense. But in other circumstances, we are talking about a functioning government with jurisdiction over people. And, let's say a weakness in the rule of law in general, but still a fairly strongly defined level of responsibility for responding to circumstances like this. And both mechanisms that we're talking about are done by external actors to some degree, or fomented, initiated. I mean, the surveys would be done with local informants and local language, and obviously the reporting upwards and outwards would include local actors in various ways. But I guess one question I would have is the ways in which we might consider problem solving and the advantages and disadvantages of each of these mechanisms and approaches with regard to the longer term goal of building up the rule of law, and the way in which these kinds of violations that are grave and egregious and that have been highlighted, as opposed to all of the other million things about the rule of law, could be done in such a way that they register more directly with governments being more responsible. I mean, the indirect route to that is through the UN family. But I wonder whether even the surveying process can play a role in the role of civic actors putting pressure on their own government at district or provincial level to be more accountable, to challenge their police to be more reasonable, or whatever.
I am so delighted you asked that, because I was negligent in that I didn't say that second round of the 2013 survey. I mentioned the 2010 survey was done because UNICEF asked us to do it. 2013 one was the local NGO we worked with in 2010 said, we think the scene has really changed. We think it should be done again. So actually, they did it. Not Columbia University just gave them technical support with the goal in mind of making a historical record and statement that things have changed. Of the 5 MRMs that we've evaluated, in terms of how complete are they, by far, the best one was an OPT. It happens to be the only one that's not a UN MRM. It is self-induced and done by the Palestinian government and the community themselves. And because it's theirs, they've added one extra thing, detainment of youth by the police. And it really is theirs. And in the West Bank, we think they captured 50% of killings and maimings, compared to 1% in CAR and 0.02% in DRC. And most importantly, when Alina Potts, the young woman who works with me, went out and was following up on the cases we heard about that didn't get into the MRM, a huge fraction of them were people who, for example, didn't have the working papers to live where they lived, and therefore the doctor had not told anyone that that child had been shot by an Israeli soldier, because if they did, the consequences for the family would have been far greater than the gun wound. And so Alina was arguing, actually maybe 50% sensitivity in this political environment is about the right level to have monitoring without starting to produce adverse consequences for those people that you're monitoring. So, there's an example where a locally initiated, a locally run, non-UN MRM is making a market difference. It really is infinitely more useful for putting pressure, in their case, they want to run the Israelis, about protecting children. It's the MRM doing what 1612 said it should do: provide accurate, timely data about trends.
And in your case, as you have reached out in your partnerships to work with not only international NGOs but local NGOs that do triangulate the difficulties of accepting a role as a monitor in their own political environment, not just in the UN political environment. What have you found might be some of the ways that pursuing the MRN process can help with local accountability as well, or affect it in some way?
Yeah, I actually wanted to complement Les's example for Palestine with Colombia, which is also, I think, an excellent example to sort of demonstrate what you're asking for. How can we use this system for facilitating direct dialogue between national and local civil society and their authorities about rights violations in an environment that it's not usually so easy for them to straightforwardly engage with their authorities. This particularly in countries where the government is not weak, the government is not absent. The Colombian government is a ruling government. It has infrastructure. Obviously, we can always, point out to some weaknesses, but still we can for the US. But it's very present. There's a very strong legal framework. There actually is national systems for data gathering. Some of them are from the government themselves, and some of them are independent commissions. And I would particularly like to refer each of you here to a very good report that our partner Coalico, which is a network of civil societies organizations in Colombia, just wrote about the quality of the data produced by government instances about rape and sexual violence, where they have contrasted this data that was available by the monitoring institutions of the national government with what they found themselves. So this is also a very interesting approach. From where I sit, where I see the difference is that if you do have a government that is stronger, that is present, just the data that you have on your prevalence, as Les would say, is more correct. It will, the correspondence between your MRM data, it will likely more reflect an assumed prevalence that is out there. Let's quote it 50% for the OPT. I don't know that you've looked into Colombia, but I can only assume that percentages will be much higher than these, very bad percentages like 1%, 3% for the CAR, for DRC. So you have more reliable data. And I would also argue that in these environments, the MRM really does what it is supposed to do. It is a political framework, but that offers a platform for civil society to directly engage with their authorities in an environment where otherwise it would be difficult or problematic for them to do so. So for the Colombians, they really want the system to be there. The civil society organizations are also part of the country-level task force because they feel it offers them the degree of protection to put pressure on their government, because the pressure is coming from above and it is coming from below. And the government is reacting to this. It reacted first by the legal framework, which is a start, but it's also certainly looking into implementation at this point in time. So from that perspective, I find that it actually works really well in terms of, and also a more sustainable engagement for putting pressures on government for taking this on as their own agenda. And it's, in that sense, it can also be adapted to local circumstances. For example, in Colombia, they also included monitoring over a violation that does not appear in Resolution 1612. They monitor forced displacement, for example, because they feel this is very relevant in Colombia. This is a problem that touches upon, this is a real problem for Colombian youth. So we want to also monitor this. And they do. And so, I really think that there's strong examples to that sense to be given.
You didn't ask about this, but in the Syrian conflict, there are 5 local NGOs that have been feeding the UN with reports of deaths. And so they compiled a report, must have been about 16 months ago, and then the UN has stopped doing it since then, that probably captured most deaths in Syria. It's never happened before that a passive surveillance system has captured most deaths while a war has been going on in real time. So I think social media and strong NGOs in countries like Syria, where the civil society is really strong and they follow very sophisticated people, is brought us to a lovely place. The flip side is Patrick Ball, the guy that was organizing that data collection for the UN, said in an email exchange we had, that he's very worried about people producing falsified data and making everything look like it's the Syrian government that's doing it. So I think like the social media heyday might have already come and gone. I think when the CIAs of other countries start getting involved in data collection, it might get much, much, much harder in the future to have the definition of problem defined by local actors without any verification. But we'll get more sophisticated verifying. So
I want to acknowledge Jennifer Peterson, who has also asked a question online, which is very similar to the answers that are coming right now from both Les and Eva, and kind of add to this and ask both of you, what role do you see, not just local institutions, but young people also playing? What role do you see children and youth play in not only monitoring, but gathering information? Because are young people talking to young people differently than an NGO, international or national? And what's the dynamic there that you know? What does the data show from your perspective?
I'm not sure I have any data on which to answer that, but this is a notion that scares me. It's a notion that scares me in many ways. We are happy about that energy in the Arab Spring, as we were 3 years ago. Are we happy about it today? I don't know. That energy in Congo, the context I know best, undermines the only functional governance mechanism they've had, which is elders. That's the only thing post-colonial era that has created any fabric and been able to sort of curb men beating their wives and those sort of things in the bush where there's no functioning government. And I don't know, but it scares me. And it's changing so fast. This is a trivial tangent, but a Congolese guy said to me a little while ago, you know, because of those 9/11 attacks, polygamy is almost gone in Eastern Congo. I said, what? Are you taking crack? Like, what's this about? And he said, no. Because of the 9/11 attacks, all the imams in Eastern Congo and in Uganda and in CAR, they got together and they agreed that polygamy was the thing that people really sort of held as savage-like about Muslims in Eastern Congo, and that the imams just essentially forbid the Congolese Muslims, of which there are hundreds of thousands in the CAR Muslims, from polygamy. And in the countryside, his explanation was, people see the Muslims as lower than them. They're sort of like halfway between dogs and humans in their mind. Even though they're rich, even though they're the merchants and they have all the advantages, they look down upon them as not being civilized. And thus, when the Muslims stopped doing it, everyone just said polygamy. It's not on. And there's now all the NGOs with women driving cars and all this other cultural stuff going on. And sure enough, we looked in our data from 2013 in a couple of areas where I had sampled in 1999 and 2000. And certainly the fraction of households that have 2 adult females is half of, that have more adult females than adult males is half of what it was in 2000. So I can't tell you why. It might not be the 9/11 attacks, but wow, society is changing so fast. And cell phones are a big part of it, and social media is a little part of it. Things are changing so fast. The notion that how people mate and produce families could change so dramatically in 15 years just terrifies me. Just terrifies me.
So it's terrifying you because you're older than a young person? I'm asking in a very safe environment, just to open the discussion to see if we understand the notion of capacity or agency of young people differently.
You're thinking about agency of young people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about loss of the tiny little bit of glue that used to exist when elder men would get together and get everyone to agree how to solve this conflict between families fighting over land or whatever it was. So I'm all for agency of young people. I'm just scared that it's arising in a time when the Rwandan government next door, Congo, can manipulate social media messages and and induce riots when there don't need to be, when someone gets fired as the head of the prison and he can socially, by social media, he can organize a prison break, and 2,000 prisoners will be released a couple of weeks ago, sort of as a retaliation for his losing his job. Like, I'm just worried about the manipulative potential that goes with some combination of that agency and cell phones.
To complement that from another perspective, from where we stand, we certainly would be very wary of involving children in monitoring grave violations or human rights violations, essentially because it is exposing them to high levels of physical insecurity, danger that already are difficult to manage for adults, so let alone for children. So this is certainly something that we want to keep them out of as much as possible. The only example that I could think of something slightly more acceptable are type of, school-based projects where you have children having diaries on, how many times is my school closed, or things like that. But that, that's about the most level that I would find acceptable in terms of having children directly monitor human rights violations.
I don't mean to push it because I fully believe this, but I want to push the discussion to see where we can discover, right? Ask questions that people are sometimes uncomfortable to ask. So I hear what you're saying, right? But young people are already, this is their living reality. They live through these violations to a great extent every single day. And they're resilient enough to manage it in their own ways. May not be the same way we think it's appropriate, but they're able to bounce off of it because of some of their peers, because of some of the networks that they create among themselves. So is it possible to assume that maybe they might create some networks that we are not familiar with that can help them bounce better, maybe not report, but actually create the networks that actually help them protect themselves, help them actually address the issues that are difficult for adults to address in a way that young people are able to address differently. I'm throwing out the question to see what we can, what is possible from this.
Yeah, but these are different issues.
Sure.
This is about child participation in programmatic response, which is very different in terms of child participation in monitoring grave violations.
Yes, I see that. No, I definitely see that. But we're still talking about violations that young people are experiencing, and the role us as internationals play, national actors play, governments play versus young people playing that process.
One interesting angle on this might be kind of where children and youth can claim their voice, because the question was framed, how can local institutions, less referred to traditional male leaders' roles in communal systems, as an example of a local institution. And we could think of other, we could think of child clubs in schools, or we could think of women's groups, or we could think of communal gatherings, or we could think of district government or local committees that are kind of quasi-governmental. All of these would be different types of local institutions in rapidly changing circumstances, where the central government of a country has a light touch, and where governance occurs, where kind of collective decision-making and action occurs, is more these other forms. And for women and for the young, generally their representation in these local institutions is less. Their active participation is welcomed less. Their voice is less. And so they know that they're not reflected well in these local institutions traditionally. So one question could be, how would programs and actors create conditions where they can be more present and join in and help shape local institutions more? So it's less young people on their own, unguided, easily manipulated by others, but more a kind of welcome part of the social capital or the civic structure as it evolves. in settings where, so in Colombia, this is not an ungoverned space like DRC, CIR, parts of Sudan, but it is a place where maybe in urban slums, in rural areas, but there's still a lot of local institutions that mediate real life. But to what degree are children, youth, young women, mothers included in those, represented in them, and can they claim their voice within them? So they could maybe offer deeper understandings of lived reality of some of these things than some men would normally bring to the table. I think that's a big open-ended cultural question that is, it's being worked out. In the Arab Spring, youth tested the proposition, trying to join in leadership processes, and they got their smack down after they took all these risks, and they're, kind of being seasoned by this struggle as traditional authority reasserts itself in new ways and different forms in their societies. And I think this is an important question. What we did is this series of questions kind of opened out from the UN actor and the externally supported research actor as public health and as UN MRM mechanism drivers. We joined in a larger set of actors, and what roles could they play in understanding the nature of crimes against children and understanding the programmatic, legal, political responses to them in a richer way, and to what degree that both of the mechanisms offer opportunities to strengthen local responses and local accountability in new ways. That's a big, open-ended, this is what we want. We don't want to have UN nanny trying to take care of this because the rule of law is not functioning. We don't want CDC to be the only trusted researcher anywhere. We want each of these things to be progressive ways of strengthening local capacities to do these things so that children have more local support to protection themselves.
Which, if we take that to its logical end, should mean we as a community should have this goal of spending less and less money on ourselves and more of our international compassion locally as time goes on. And the UN should be aspiring to be a smaller institution every year, and IRC should be aspiring to be a smaller institution every year. And that isn't part of our culture. We all have examples of football teams formed in refugee camps that just did amazing, socially wonderful things. But the reason I'm terrified is because we know so little about children and trauma in children. We pretend we do, and maybe someone does a study in Eastern Europe about orphans, and we think we have some insight. But a couple of weeks ago, Maya Angelou died. And there was this wonderful repeat of an interview with her on Fresh Air, and I didn't realize that she was raped when she was 6 and then was mute for 6 years as a result of that. What was the dynamic that happened there? How would one have repaired there? Do I think there's any NGO that could have contributed to her life? I don't think so. I think the best thing to do was just to stay the hell away and for no one to do anything. So giving space and giving space for kids to play football and talk with each other and solve their own issues seems to me a wonderful, logical thing. But I'm just terrified that NGOs can't do that. They can't give. They can create the international NGOs. Yeah.
No, I'm very much
Any last comments, questions? Well, then we would like just to open the floor to any sharing of information. This is a network of the members. So if there is anything that you would like to mention, announce, forthcoming meeting reports that's been issued, now available, need a consultant, something related to children and armed conflict, now's your opportunity to share it with the network and those who are watching online.
Can kick off the announcement actually. Search for Common Ground, in partnership with the UN Peacebuilding Support Office, is co-chairing UN civil society and youth-led interagency mechanism around youth and young people's participation in peace building. And On April 24th in New York, we launched the guiding principles for young people's participation in peace building, consultative process that reached over 2,000 technical advisors, senior managers in UN and international NGOs and youth organizations and developed these guiding principles. And they are available in Spanish, French, Russian, and Arabic. I've been told that the Arabic translation is not 100% accurate by young people in Yemen. But but this, if you scroll down a little, you'll find the things available in different languages. But then what we are now kicking off is the operational guidance process for this. Again, very much a collaborative interagency process of bringing all these agencies together to really look at how do you develop, use the guiding principles to develop good operational guidance for program managers, design programs in a way that actually useful and is sensitive and engaging of young people. This process is leading to helping to set up communities of learning and practice at the country level, bringing together donor agencies, international agencies, UN agencies, local organizations, coming together across sectors. So to try to see how it is the link strong enough that an educated public leads to less violence itself. High employment rates, does that lead to less violence? So those kinds of conversations will be taking place at the country level. And the first start of that is actually starting in Lebanon and Yemen and a couple of other countries in Nepal and Congo as well. And so this is a process that is ongoing and with lots of difficulties, but this is something that we are very excited about. And it's also helping to create a mechanism of trying to coordinate around different agencies. So UN Habitat approached the World Bank to say we want to actually support youth and peace building. But that process is now brought to this interagency mechanism to see how we can build on existing knowledge instead of just one UN agency running off and doing the same thing that others are also doing. So it's trying to, in a sense, become more collaborative and coordinated around youth and peace building at least. So it's a step, I think, in the right direction. Just wanted to share that mechanism that exists, and we welcome other partners who are being part of it. Anyone interested, I'm happy to share more information and bring on board also to the process.
Any other information to share? Well, if not, I just want to thank Eva and Les very, very much.
Thank you
for coming with your very thoughtful, thought-provoking, informative presentations. Really appreciate it, and it will be available online.
Yes, the PowerPoints, both presentations are available online already, and so you should be having access to that. And we'll send out an announcement if you archive it. There's no more gifts for you to take away with you.
Thank you, everyone online.
Thanks a lot for my picture.
Yes.